Sit.
And we go live now.
So welcome again. This is the S4D4C Final networking event. My name is Elke Dahl. I have the pleasure to coordinate the project and to welcome you today. But actually the real welcome is going to be spoken by the Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation of Colombia, Her Excellency Mabel Gisela Torres. So we are going to launch the video shortly.
Cuando hablamos de diplomacia científica, es importante decir que la diplomacia científica es un instrumento que nos permite generar más y mejores relaciones entre las regiones, entre los países y entre los diferentes actores. Es por esto que desde el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación y en este primer año de creación hemos estado trabajando en una estrategia de diplomacia científica que nos permita construir relaciones y posicionar la ciencia colombiana en otros países. Dentro de nuestras estrategias, este año conformamos una mesa de diplomacia científica con la presencia de Cancillería, los actores internacionales y los investigadores. Por eso, hoy queremos invitarlos a que a través de estas relaciones y de la diplomacia nosotros podamos abordar temas globales. Por ejemplo, el cambio climático global, la pérdida de biodiversidad y pandemias y crisis como la que nos genera el COVID nos invita a que generemos relaciones a través de la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación. Este año el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación empieza con una gran apuesta y es la de crear los nodos de diplomacia científica en otras regiones y en otras partes del mundo, regiones geográficas o zonas de frontera, con un firme propósito, el de posicionar la ciencia colombiana y poder también con esto intervenir y aportar a las decisiones políticas. La diplomacia científica se constituye en un instrumento muy importante para todas las naciones y es así como nosotros, como país, como nación, le apostamos a generar estas relaciones a través de la ciencia, la tecnología y la innovación.
Well, thank you, Minister Torres. Thank you, Elke. It's my pleasure to be chairing this next plenary session of the conference. My name's James Wilsden, and I'm based at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And I'm also the Vice Chair of the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA. So it's a real pleasure to have now a fantastic lineup of speakers to talk through the theme of multilateral science diplomacy. And particularly the changing role within that of international scientific organizations. Multilateralism, of course, has had a bumpy few years, but I think if nothing else, the last year has reminded us of both the necessity of and the barriers to scientific cooperation as we've all grappled in different ways and at different places with the pandemic. In this panel, we want to take stock of the prospects for multilateral science diplomacy, looking beyond the pandemic to what lies ahead, and consider lessons that can be learned and applied not only from the past year, but from other areas, including climate change, education, and broader debates over resilience. We have, as you'll see from the slide, a really stellar panel to guide us through these debates. We're going to hear first in a moment from Lidia Brito, who is Director of UNESCO's Regional Bureau for Sciences in Latin America and the Caribbean. Lidia will be followed by Mohammed Hassan, President of the World Academy of Sciences, then by Albert van Jaarsveld, Director General of IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and finally, we are going to hear from Thelma Krug, Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So across those different international organizations, you've got a really good sweep of some of the main players in this space. We look forward to a really interesting discussion. Each of the speakers is going to open up with no more than 5 or 6 minutes of introductory remarks, and then I hope we will all stick to time and have plenty of opportunity then for discussion and questions. Can I remind participants to make regular and good use of the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. So put your questions in there as they crop up, and we will try and work through as many of those as time allows towards the end of the session. There's also, of course, the chat box where you can also continue, as always, having more informal discussion and exchange. So I think that's all I need to say at this point. Let me again thank you for joining us and hand over first to Lidia Brito. Lidia.
Thank you very much, and allow me to share a short presentation. And really what I would like to talk about today, it's how science diplomacy that has been present in the case of UNESCO since its creation has changed over the years. In effect, when the UNESCO initially was thought about, it didn't have science. It had education and culture as a result of the needs of a world destroyed by the Second World War. And a group of scientists said we need science, because without scientific cooperation, it's going to be very difficult to build bridges between countries that were enemies during the war, and it will be very hard to recover from the destruction of the war. And that's how the S in UNESCO came about. And part of the initial work of UNESCO was to create spaces for scientific cooperation. And the very first and oldest example was the decision to create CERN in a meeting in UNESCO headquarters, saying we need to collaborate among countries in Europe that were divided by the war. We are continuing that work with constructing those spaces. It's the case of Sesame. We had a wonderful project with IPSO between Israel and Palestine, using science as bridge for dialogue and friendship. A lot of the intergovernmental programs of UNESCO, like the hydrological program, the MAB program, the Geopark program, they are all programs that promote scientific collaboration and scientific diplomacy, because they have transnational issues that they deal with. And of course, the World Science Forum and the regional open science fora that UNESCO has promoted. And in fact, science diplomacy was seen in three classic axes, science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. But the truth is, today's world needs different science, and Albert probably will talk about that. So if we need a different science, then we need to think of science diplomacy in a different way. And I think the video from the minister from Colombia, from the region where I work, is a good example of that. So we have seen that the issue of rights become fundamental in science, and the right to science, the benefits of science, it's in effect an enabler for the right to wealth, the right to live in a clean environment, the right to quality education, and so on. More than creating CERN and SESAM-like centers, what we are seeing around the world is that countries developed agreements to share scientific infrastructure and scientific data infrastructure. Because the kind of science we are doing in nowadays and the kind of challenges we need that share infrastructure and also human capacity. Much more mobility and joint capacity programs. And the ethical issues, and this pandemic has showed the importance of that, has really become at the core of science and technology for humanity. And the common agenda for sustainable development, it's also bringing science at the core of the political, the social, the economical, and the environmental decisions. But it's also, because it's a common agenda, it's also something that brings science together. As well, many of the agreements that I'm sure that the panelists will talk about, like the Paris Agreement and among others. So the science diplomacy then is changing, because it's not just promoting science of your country or for your country, but it's really a common good. and the human rights. And that's why in UNESCO we are proposing and promoting open science mechanisms and instruments to make sure that that part of the science endeavor, the right for science and benefits of science and of co-producing knowledge, it's really part of the diplomacy. As we listen to the minister, agendas and structures that promote and pursue science diplomacy are growing in different countries, and in this region it's not away from that. It's Colombia, it's Brazil, it's Panama, it's many, Costa Rica, many countries in our region are creating agendas for science diplomacy and structures that can implement those agendas. Another big change in my view is that it's not just governments and it's not just diplomats. It's really other actors coming around. And I think that the work that IASA and ISC did last year on really reflecting on the role of science and how to strengthen the science systems around the world and bringing that to a political space was a very good example of scientists and academia and research centers taking the lead in bringing the importance of scientific collaboration, of strengthening the capacity of science as a common endeavor and not something that is just an individual agenda for each country in the world, but it's really a common agenda and we need to work together there. And of course, the transnational issues such as climate change, pandemics, inequalities, extreme violence, they all need science solutions. But if they are transnational, they need a component of science diplomacy that has to be there. Diplomacy has to be there, and that means that we need to come together. And again, ethical principles related to science, to new technologies, it has to be also seen as a work for multilateralism, that a global pact that ensure human rights as humanity developed, new knowledge, new technologies, and so on. And really to finish, and a little bit of propaganda, part of our work in this region is to promote precisely regional scientific collaboration and dialogues and spaces for all these different actors, from governments, private sector, academia, civil society, really to discuss what can we do better in order to have that science that we need for sustainable development in the region and globally. And that's why we are on the third Open Science Forum for Latin America and the Caribbean will be this April, and you can pre-register. And part of the agenda, as always, this is the third forum we organized, part of the agenda is precisely related to science diplomacy and the role of science diplomacy in advancing science for human development, and also how can we collaborate and learning from each other when we deal with transnational issues as we are today. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lidia. That's a really good introduction and helps set the scene superbly in terms of the progression of these debates. We're going to move next to Mohammed Hassan, who is, I hope you won't mind me saying, a distinguished veteran of these debates, been in these discussions longer than most of us. Always great to hear Mohammed's thoughts. I can see he's online. I can't see his video, but hopefully, Mohammed, you're hearing me.
I'm online, but I want to share my screen. I don't know how to share my screen. I would like to share my screen.
Oh, there's a button at the bottom in the middle with an arrow pointing up saying share screen. So if you click on that, it should give you your slide options. Meanwhile, I don't think the camera, or at least I'm not seeing your picture, Mohammed. So I tell you what, shall we give you a minute to sort that out? And while you do, we might move over to Albert, just to avoid
go ahead,
lengthy.
Go ahead.
And hopefully the colleagues can help you with some of the technology behind the scenes, Mohammed, if it's tricky. Albert, are you good to go if we move move
Yes,
to you
we're
next.
happy to do that. Thank you. Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and thank you everybody for the invitation to participate today. Looking forward to the conversation. From my side, I'm not going to share slides with you today, but just want to raise a few issues. As you would have heard in some of the other talks already, that IASA as an institution, as a child of science diplomacy, it was created in 1972 through the vision of President Johnson and Premier Kosygin when they established IASA as a scientific institute to bridge East-West collaboration. They thought scientific collaboration was required, and that's how IASA was established in 1972. So we're celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. So watch this space; something will happen in that regard. As an institution, of course, we focus on systems analysis, as indicated by our name. But IASA has always been a key participant in what we like to call a soft science diplomacy. In other words, by acting as a vehicle to bridge different communities and to bring scientific communities together, particularly in parts of the world where conversations may be very difficult at the political level. We find that the engagement at a scientific level really makes those conversations easier over time by virtue of scientific collaboration. So that's really where IASA excels as an institution. We've been involved in lots of multilateral scientific programs and of that ilk. Just to give you a recent example, involved in conversations around land use, energy efficiency, and water use in the Indus Valley. That'll give you a sense of the sort of pressure points that we work under. But it certainly was a very successful engagement that's resulted in follow-up actions from those respective countries to take the research forward. We currently have 24 member organizations, and IASA has moved from the 1970s when it was established as an East-West institute to an institution that now focuses on global and what we call universal and shared problems around the world. So much of our work focuses on those research problems that require a global perspective, or otherwise a shared perspective across the boundaries of nation states. And that is the crux of the research work that we're involved with at the moment. And of course, as you know, the last year with the COVID crisis, many of these global issues have been exacerbated, and we have to spend additional time and resources to tackle them. I think the delivery on Agenda 2030 was pushed back a little bit as a consequence of COVID, and I think there was an immediate gut reaction to try and get the economies going again, and I think we're still struggling with that across the world. But at the end of the day, the point of view that we tried to push in the work that Lidia referred to earlier last year was basically the notion that no nation state will achieve the SDGs or Agenda 2030 or sustainability unilaterally. And in order to solve these problems of climate change, emergent pandemics, water and food security, etc., will require collaboration between states. And it will require a collective global effort to solve these problems. It cannot be done in a bit-piece manner. So what we're trying to put on the table as a research institution is that the continued and expansion of science diplomacy in order to achieve and deliver on these global problems that we have is a very important imperative. And I think science diplomacy is going to only grow in importance because there's some very difficult conversations that would have to be had in order to achieve a global commitment to solve global problems collectively across the world. Of course, this also means changing the way we do our science. I think Lidia referred to it earlier as well. And that means we have to think about how we fund science, for instance. At the moment, less than between 5 and 2% of global science funding supports multilateral research across the globe. Rest of it, and by far the biggest gravity of science funding, lies at a national level. It's understandable that countries have focused on developing and growing their national scientific infrastructure and interests. But if we want to solve these global problems, we're going to have to put money towards those problems and deal with them appropriately. That means that a large chunk of funding will have to be secured to do global science, to tackle shared problems, to tackle universal problems that we have to deal with. And for some other reason, we've never managed to get this right. I think it's one of the challenges for the scientific and diplomatic community as to how we can take hands to ensure that we can try and achieve the resources, the scientific teams, and the infrastructure, even if it's soft infrastructure, to allow us to deliver on these global research objectives. It seems rather odd that when we want to build science infrastructure, such as CERN or the Square Kilometre Array, or other projects around the world, we do find the national contributions that get put into the collective pot to deliver on a joint venture. But when we have to tackle global research problems, such as water security or food for all, it's impossible to achieve that for some other reason. We're going to have to change the way that we think about the funding, the establishment of the scientific teams and soft infrastructure that are required to deliver on these global issues, and it has to be done collectively. I think it's really important. There's some important conversations on the go at the moment in the International Science Council, the Global Forum for Funders, and the Global Research Council to see what can be done in this space. But I think if we're serious about Agenda 2030 and all that it entails, whether it's we're talking about inequality issues, a new economic system that has to be developed and put on the table, or whether we're just talking about food for all, these things need to be tackled at a global level and need to be invested in at a global level. So for us, I think this is one of the key issues that science diplomacy can assist us with, to try and drive this global science agenda that's required, and to make sure that we as a society can work together and towards what I call a dignified future for humanity. I guess we'll always have a future, but I'm not sure that's necessarily one we want. So if we can strive for a dignified future, then I think we have to tackle these global problems. And with that, James, I'll leave it there for the moment and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. Again, a really eloquent distillation of where things are at and the role of IASA. Also, that very important reminder about the importance of proper funding for multilateral endeavours of various kinds. There's a huge debate right now in the UK. We've just had a big cut to our international aid budgets, as some of you will be aware. And with that has come an unravelling of all sorts of international collaborative research commitments that had been very positively put in place over recent years. So it's frustrating to see the sort of stop-start nature of some of these things. We will return to that, I'm sure, in questions. Let's move now, hopefully in the time that Albert's been speaking, Mohammed has had a chance to sort out his tech troubles. Mohammed, are you there?
He is not, but we are reaching out to him, so we will connect later.
Ah, okay. Okay, we will improvise. We also, as I understand it, are currently lacking Thelma Krug, so we are 2 up, 2 down at the moment on our panel of 4. Mohammed definitely is, as it were, in the building virtually, but not in front of us right now. So we will return to him as soon as he comes. But let's maybe skip then to 1 or 2 questions that have come up while we wait for Mohammed to return. Lydia, just coming to you, we've had a question in from Charlotte saying, when you say in your talk that different science is needed, in what sense is the science needed now really different from earlier science or traditional science, apart from issues around accessing results and associated things? So just sort of elaborate a bit on what's actually happening in the research system.
I think there are a few key changes. One is that it has to be much more focus orientated in terms of identifying development challenges and bringing solutions for today and for tomorrow's issues. And to do that, you need more integration of the different fields of science, and we cannot have the silos that we had before. And a good example of that is, for example, Future Earth. It's the ISC itself that have merged, all the science, the natural science fields and the social science fields and humanities together to address the common challenges and pursuing scientific knowledge for solutions. But I would go further than that, and I think the integration also of cultural contexts, of not only multi-sectorial and transdisciplinary, but also multi-stakeholder in the production and the co-production of knowledge. I think the importance of co-design and co-production of knowledge today is fundamental. And that means also to mobilize communities to be part of the scientific endeavor. I also believe that science more than ever has to have a social impact, and it has to transform society. There is this capacity of science and scientific knowledge to really bring impact and transformation in our societies. But that means to communicate and to create a scientific culture that many times we don't see it as part of the science responsibility. So we do need to create in societies this scientific culture. I also believe that more partnerships, more networks, we need to have more think tanks together because these are transnational, these are global issues. And I think Albert mentioned that how hard it is sometimes to do joint research programs when we know that in order to address the challenge, we need to work transnationally and many times also globally. And also something that I believe that science has a role to play, but that means to do science in a different way, is the capacity to learn, to unlearn, to learn again. When we talk about sustainable development, we are talking about also changing our behaviors. And there is an unlearning process there that is sometimes very hard for humans to do. And I think science has a lot to contribute in the dialogue with societies, creating that space so that people can indeed learn and relearn, and if necessary, unlearn to learn again. So it's more on those aspects that I was mentioned. I'm not sure I respond fully to Charlie.
No, that's great. Thank you, Lidia. That's very helpful. Just building also, Albert, on your comments towards the end there about funding, and Lydia's picked it up again. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about, I guess, how optimistic or pessimistic you are looking across the research landscape today in 2021 about the prospect for more of those sorts of multilateral funding mechanisms and schemes. I mean, of course, when things like the Global Research Council were first launched, it was 2010, 11, 12, that was the sort of aspiration that they would gradually move in that sort of direction, but it hasn't really yet happened. Do you think something like the pandemic will be a real trigger? Because even there, you've got obviously a lot of contrasting impulses in systems. We're seeing, on the one hand, of course, the case made for collaboration, and on the other hand, fresh forms of scientific nationalism, vaccines, et cetera, So I guess sort of how sort of realistic is the prospect that we're actually going to see genuine progress on some of this in the next few years? You're muted, Albert, sorry.
Quickly, sorry. I'm generally, I try and be positive in my science engagement, and I think we need to try and push the envelope as best as we can. I think the point you make, James, about forces going in opposite directions during the COVID pandemic in particular, I think just highlighted some of the weaknesses that we have in our international science systems at the moment. And I guess the instinctive reaction is always to retreat, to strengthen and look after your own first, and try and tackle things on that basis. Unfortunately, when we talk about global research issues that we have to tackle, water security, for instance, is not something that you're going to achieve unilaterally. Because you may be okay today, but tomorrow your neighbor's got a problem and you have shared resources, and then the conflicts will flare up again, and we have to deal with it collectively. So to have a sustainable solution, it's something that, for instance, or food security for that matter, is something that we have to deal with collectively if you want to have a sustainable solution. The investment in multilateral science, as I indicated, has been very, very small. And frankly, has been driven up to now, even though it's a multilateral process that gets put in place, has still been driven by national interests. In other words, national governments will only pay for their own scientists, for their participation. For example, they would assess the proposals independently and then see if they can find a agreement at the end in terms of what we're going to fund or so on. But it's really been driven to strengthen the national scientific basis within a particular country. That has got to change, and we need to understand that we have to make a collective investment that allows us to bring together the best scientists from around the world to tackle a particular problem. And that particular problem needs to be dealt with not in a establishment of a long-term research agenda or anything like that. It needs to be what we call science mission driven. In other words, it should be very explicit and very targeted in terms of the objective of a particular project. It should be, for instance, to eradicate infectious disease, for argument's sake. And it's got to be a very targeted objective, or alternatively, let's eliminate hunger around the world, as another example. And these kind of science missions, I think, that can be driven at a global level collectively through collective investment, because I think there's something that will really change the trajectory of the world and the prospects for sustainability fundamentally. The Global Research Council is having a very serious conversation at the moment after 10 years of establishment to actually ask itself these kinds of questions. And I know the International Science Council is going to be making submissions to this kind of effect towards the end of next month in the engagement with the Global Research Council. We hope that the Global Research Council can identify, and I think it should probably be a handful at most, of key important missions that have to be tackled first and that have to be funded. Hopefully they can find a way of bringing together a collective contribution from across the global research councils to try and tackle this. But I think they should also challenge not only governments, but also the private sector and the foundations to make matching contributions towards these issues. If we're focusing on infectious diseases, there are foundations that have already made historically huge investments in this space. And these kind of science mission objectives are possible and feasible. I think the injections in areas like HIV/AIDS in the past, the global focus in the work there, the work in malaria that's going on through the Gates Foundation and so on, indicates that these kinds of science-driven mission objectives at a global level are possible. But we have to identify which are the ones that are most pressing, which are the ones that we should be tackling first, and will likely have the biggest impact to drive us towards the development or the delivery of Agenda 2030 at the end of the day. And I'm hoping that the Global Research Council will step up to the plate and see what they can do in collaboration with their national governments. And again, science diplomacy will be required at that level to bring people on board. But we have done so in the past. We have had national governments commit to funding international science infrastructure. In the International Space Station, in the CERN infrastructure was established. They're busy building the square kilometer array in South Africa and Australia at the moment. These interventions are possible if the will is there. It's a question of us targeting the right things to get the right result.
Thank you. And I'll come to Lidia in a second, but just another quick follow-up, if I may, on the, it's very interesting, this discussion about GRC and other bodies. I mean, I just wonder, if we think back sort of 2 or 3 years ago to when Pascal Lamy and others evaluated Horizon 2020, there was a lot of talk about a more radical opening up of the next European Framework Programme, and going beyond the association model to something that would try and, I guess, move that more into the space you're describing as a sort of research funding program for the world. That hasn't been fully realized. And I just wondered, I suppose, you know, are you disappointed that that didn't happen? Do you think that was ever a realistic option?
Well, I think
somewhere new with something like the GRC.
Well, I think let me be fair to the European Commission in this regard, because I think they've been the outlier in the global arena, and they have really pushed the envelope in terms of opening up their science to participation from scientists around the world, funding projects from around the world. I think they've shown the way, but they've used the European base to do it, and I don't think they've had enough support from around the world to really achieve that at a global scale. I think it's going to be difficult to do that without the buy-in from the US or China and other big funders in that space to try and tackle these particular issues. But I do think that, you know, talking about post-COVID and where we find ourselves now, we have seen the ugly side of not getting this right. And we're experiencing the ugly side of not getting this right in terms of what's happened with the vaccination programs. But let's learn from that, and hopefully we can do better as far as some of the other objectives are concerned into the future. So I'm hoping that the example that's been led from the European Commission will take us forward. There's some other instruments that have tried to do this. The Belmont Forum comes to mind as one of those instruments where there's a lot of collective participation in what they call these collective research actions around the world. But the instrument is too complicated and too cumbersome. And everybody only funds their own researchers, and I don't think they're building research teams through that process that are optimally positioned to actually tackle these broad issues. I think that process can be improved, and I think anybody in the Belmont Forum would agree with that if you ask them today what's going on. But they're working within the framework of existing limitations, and I think they feel they're fighting this fight with their hands tied behind their back, and that's a little bit difficult. So we need to open up that space, absolutely.
Right, thank you. Very interesting. I know Lidia also wants to come in on this funding question. Lidia, when you do, can I also roll in another question that's come in from Lorenzo? And ask you to offer a few thoughts on this as well. Lorenzo asks, in your experience, what kinds of frictions and challenges exist for intergovernmental organizations to actively take a leadership position in science diplomacy, as opposed to relying on national governments to provide that kind of leadership? It must be a perennial concern within UNESCO. But so thoughts either on the funding or on that. I should say as well, Mohammed is still having trouble logging back in, so until he does, we will benefit really from the opportunity for more in-depth conversation between IASI, UNESCO, and the rest of us. But Lidia,
thank you, James. And I think Albert mentioned that one of the challenges for us is how to guarantee that you have global financing to promote the science systems everywhere in the world, in particular in countries that have very incipient science systems. And the reason why I raised my hand, and I will lower it now, is that part of the issue is these joint global research projects, because they attract top scientists on the areas. They forgot that they need to create the generation of the top scientists in countries that have very incipient science programs. More than speaking about teams of excellence, maybe starting to think as networks of excellence, where you have a top scientific team that at the same time involves young people from around the world to start building the new generation of scientists, and also bringing this connection that you need today among scientists and science systems, if indeed you want to promote science as a human right, if you want to promote sustainable development. So I would say to Lorenzo, part of the friction is what Albert was saying. The countries have their own agendas and scientific agendas to solve their problems, but their problems are transnational, are global. So how do you convince them that by investing in these global initiatives, you are in effect bringing back to your society knowledge that is very much needed? And that's why, for example, in UNESCO, we are proposing, and hopefully will be approved in our General Conference this year, the open science recommendation. How do we, by accepting that science is a common good, how do we make sure that national-wide and regional and global-wide, we accept to share data, to share infrastructure, to share human capacity, to share and open spaces for young researchers in other countries that don't have that scientific field. And I mean, Albert, you guys do a lot of the summer internships for young researchers in countries that don't have the possibility really to study and to learn on the best place possible in scientific issues. So it is a challenge, and I think it's not just funding the agendas themselves. I think that the topics that we want to research many times are linked to national agendas. So our work is to open up these dialogues and to convince governments to work together. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is showing the importance of doing that. We did wrong because we didn't have the mechanisms and instruments to really promote the scientific knowledge needed for us to be safer. And the scientific community moved ahead and started collaborating. So there is a lot of hope, and the velocity how scientific knowledge was shared among scientific communities, I think is something that we have to recognize. And also the trust in science. I think I want to say that this is a great opportunity. There is trust in science in our societies today. And we need to keep building that trust, and we need to build that scientific culture that we need in order to change political agendas and financing mechanisms for global science.
Great, thank you, Lidia, very much again. Just to encourage everyone, do keep firing in more questions, and we will we'll work through as many as we can in the remaining time. Albert, we've got another one that's coming for you from Christina. You mentioned in your initial remarks that many of the critical global challenges that need to be addressed have been downgraded or I've forgotten, maybe too strong a word, but certainly haven't had the prominence and attention that they deserve over the course of the pandemic. Is now the time to start drawing attention to how easy is it, I guess, to transition out of a kind of crisis of this magnitude into a more broad spectrum discussion? The same, of course, applies to funding. We've had this debate about the dangers of the so-called COVIDization of funding responses, where lots and lots of money gets plowed into fighting the last crisis rather than anticipating the 5 or 6 that may lie ahead. I remember my former colleague Martin Rees saying early on in the pandemic last year, who's our astronomer royal here in the UK, that it was great to see the response to the pandemic, but he has this centre at Cambridge for the study of existential risk. But of course, now all the resources would go into pandemic preparedness, which we can all applaud, and it would be then an asteroid strike that would see us off. So I guess from EASA's perspective specifically, or just more broadly as you think about, I guess shifting the conversation is one way of framing the question. How easy, how quickly can one start to do that?
Well, I think the COVID experience emphasizes just how critical some of the other issues are that we're facing. I mean, the climate issue is something that I think everybody is acutely aware of at the moment. The issues around inequality around the world, rising inequality, which is even more disconcerting. It's not just a question of a status quo; it's becoming worse and worse by the year. And that's going to essentially, if we just ignore it, is going to undermine the political project, essentially around the world, whatever that may be, because people will respond and react to this. And I think national governments and people need to be aware of that. The other issues, of course, are critical. Thinking about food security, the trade implications of a sustainable food security regime are fundamental. Trying to deal with the poverty, you know, if you want to eradicate poverty, then we have to think about the entire system. But I think the SDGs have actually summarized in a very nice, coherent way what are some of the key challenges we face. And I think everybody's bought into them in principle, but not necessarily in practice. And I think we have to work very hard as a scientific community to use this, not just the threat posed by COVID, but use it as an opportunity to grow back a alternative future, which is more sustainable, which is on the right pathways, or sets us on the right pathways to ensure that we grow our economies, our societies, our consumption patterns, the way that we generate the resources that we require, in a way that will put us on a sustainability trajectory as a society as a whole. So it's also an opportunity, because we do have to invest in our economies. We've seen the huge amounts that have been invested. If I remember, between 12 and 14 trillion, depending on who you believe, is going to be plowed back by different governments into regrowing their economies. The question is, are we going to plow that back to simply go back to where we were and to put ourselves on the trajectory which we knew was unsustainable and is going to lead to terrible outcomes and is going to exacerbate many of the problems that we face? Or can we invest that money in a way that puts us on an alternative pathway and an alternative course to come out as a society better equipped to deal with some of these global challenges that we face, and that aren't going to go away and will simply come back in one form or the other in the next decade or two.
Great, thank you, Albert. Yeah, that's very helpful. We've had another one that either of you may want to tackle, from your former IASA colleague Jan-Marco Muller, Albert. Jan-Marco asks, how could international scientific infrastructures help each other beyond their specific areas of expertise, sort of networking the networked infrastructures together? So he says, for example, using the fact that CERN is based in Geneva, IASA Vienna, JRC part of the Commission, ICTP part of Unesco, etc. And we've had a related sort of or a connected question that has sort of come through on the chat from Veronique, just asking why the SKA is cited so frequently as an example of I guess, good practice in worldwide collaborative infrastructure, given that there are lots of other possible examples. Do we sort of end up always falling back on the same sort of few examples, and why is that the case? So again, Albert, either of those, and also Lidia, I'm sure will have views on both.
I'm sure Lidia can add. But just from my side, to first of all talk about the SKA, I think it's just because it's something that's happening at the moment, and therefore I think it's in everybody's mind's eye. These things get pulled up as examples. I mean, there've been many other examples of co-investments, and I think the traditional one, of course, is CERN, where people have, where many countries have invested infrastructure or time and money to make it happen. We'd mentioned the International Space Station as another example, which doesn't always come up, but I think it's one. But I think the idea is that many of the other projects, the smaller ones, are generally sort of bilateral and smaller configurations of nation states that contributed to them. These bigger ones are the ones where you have broader configurations of nation states that work together and actually contributed collectively. And so I think those are the ones that then jump up in the conversations, rather than, it's not a provincialism issue. It's simply it's just I know the SKA well because it was part of my job a few years ago to manage that facility and its build. But I think the issue around that Gianmarco raises is very important. There's a conversation that started amongst the large science infrastructures at the moment called the abbreviation for the grouping of large infrastructures is called bridges. But I think the idea is for us to learn from one another, because all of us are involved in science diplomacy at one level or another. And we are learning from each other about what works and what doesn't work. So it's a question of sharing good practice amongst these different institutions. But at the same time, I think they are collectively, these infrastructure institutions are collectively an example of broad-scale global collaborations that happen and that attracts scientists from many parts of the world to work together at CERN, for argument's sake. And so the idea is that collectively they are probably one of the big contributors to using science as a bridge builder between different scientific communities, and very importantly, in the context of what Lidia said earlier, making sure that our science is inclusive. In other words, that people from around the world can participate in these activities, that the work is representative. In other words, it's not closed off to anybody. It's transgenerational, I think, which is really important. I think the young people need to come on board as well. And so these facilities serve as platforms, not only for producing the science that they were created to do, but they serve as platforms for the development of the next generation of scientists, broadening up the scientific community and opening up the scientific community. And I think in that sense, besides the best practice issues, they can all contribute collectively towards growing more vibrant international scientific community.
Excellent, thank you, Albert. Lidia, I'll return to you. I mean, both on that question around collaborative infrastructures, but also if I could play in a next question as well to get you going as well. Alejandra has asked a very good question in the context of international organizations such as both of your own. What should be the role of academia and universities in supporting and strengthening the work that you do in advancing science diplomacy? Are they doing enough? Could they do more? If so, what would that look like? So yeah, either of those. Lidia.
Thank you very much. And I was laughing with the SKA because Albert was so much involved on that, that for sure he should mention it as a very interesting collaborative project. And I know because as a Minister of Science of Mozambique, we create the coalition of African countries to support South Africa in having part of the SKA project developed in South Africa. So in a way, being from that part of the world, it's of course a very dear project to both of us. But indeed there are others, and I mention others that I think they are quite important as well. In relation to the role of the scientific community, I think is crucial. And in fact, I use this opportunity to thank all the scientists that have created in their universities, in their research centers, UNESCO chairs in specific areas, networks of chairs, category 2 centers of UNESCO, that what they do is precisely producing scientific knowledge to guarantee that we have science evidence to tackle the challenge we face as humanity. So definitely, and in the COVID-19, I think that role was very clear, because a lot of the scientific community not only produced the knowledge we need to understand better what was happening and the nature of the pandemic, but they also became spokespersons for science and for the scientific knowledge that could help decision making in their countries, in their regions, and around the world. And I think that's quite important to recognize. And for UNESCO, of course, the academia is one of our key partners and will continue to be a key partner to what we do, because they do science and they understand the scientific processes, and they allow us to then develop recommendations, conventions, policy papers that then influence governments' decisions and multilateral agreements. But before I stop, because I think we are finishing, there is a very good question about education. And I think, yes, education has to change. It's already changing on the delivery mode. There's more and more we have online delivery, but it has to change also in content and in the way we maintain curiosity, the way we allow these learning spaces really to grow and to make sure that education is of quality for everybody. Inequalities in education was a visible problem during the COVID-19, but not only in terms of access, but also content and the capacity to use the infrastructure. We talk about the gap on infrastructure, digital infrastructure, but we rarely talk about the gap that you have people that are digital citizens and they can use the digital technologies to act, to learn, to grow, to develop. And you have citizens, the majority, that are not digital citizens. So they are consumers of information, including a lot of fake news, and they cannot use the digital space to act as citizens. So there are a lot of things that we need to do, and we are doing our share in developing some of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidia. We're nearly running out of time. I wanted to throw in, just before you go, a couple of more, well, these are difficult questions, so difficult questions to answer quickly, but just to put them on the agenda, even if we don't have time to properly answer them. So I'll just give you these and then offer you 30 seconds or so of final comments before we start to wrap up. We'll also then, I think, have a chance to see the visualization of this session. But just very quickly, I guess more sort of critical points that have been thrown into the mix but are worth reflecting on. Tim Flink asks how to cope with authoritarian states and regimes in tackling grand challenges and assembling the kinds of science diplomacy coalitions that we've been discussing. Jaconia asks also about the extent to which the pandemic has shone a light on the control that some countries exercise over the agenda of international institutions like the WHO. We can debate whether that's the case or not. But I mean, in terms of science diplomacy operating as it's, I guess, idealized, one wants to transcend some of those interests. And I guess, how realistic is that? As I say, you've got about 30 seconds each to offer very, very quick parting thoughts. Albert.
I can just quickly say that over the last 5 years or so, there's been no relationship between the kind of political system operating in a country and their commitments to the global objectives and the global agenda. So there's not any indication that a particular political system is either pro or for or against or supportive of the global agenda. So I don't think it should be a barrier.
Thank you. And Lidia.
Thank you very much. I think it's just to have a common agenda for all the countries, the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. I think that's a great achievement. And I think that's where we need to make sure that we can, like Albert was mentioned, some of the science issues, that we really need to invest and bring the scientific evidence to the global community to really make the changes that we need. And more than ever, academia has to be committed also to this global agenda that is an agenda about rights. And it's an inclusive agenda. And I think working through that allow us a much larger space for dialogue and construction.
Thank you both very much. We've come in precisely on time, and often in these sessions one is compressed for time by having too many speakers. So thank you both for your really thoughtful, insightful contributions and for the time we've had really to dig a bit more deeply than would sometimes be the case. I think it's been a very interesting conversation, lots of themes to follow up on. I'll say thank you formally to Albert von Jaarsveld, to Lidia Brito. Let me just end by asking our colleagues to flash up the graphic that distills the conversation we've just been having in beautifully vivid form. Really good to see that, and it'll be great to see all of these put together at the end of the meeting. With that, my thanks again. Really interesting session. We look forward to what comes next. Stay tuned to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Keep well. Bye-bye.